quite often, in a country situation or even at a global setting, you'll start to interact with the same people repeatedly, particularly if they are therapy area experts in your market or at a global level, or if they're authoritative organizations or if they're patient groups. Building trust with that credibility, particularly in medical affairs, with that openness and the transparency of your interactions, making sure that you're adhering to all the kind of legal, ethical and moral obligations that we have to, you're able to then build trust. And maintaining trust through adversity. Sometimes people will come to you with a request, whether it's for funds or for support, and the answer is no. And that's hard. That's a hard answer to give. Nobody likes to say no, but sometimes that's the credible thing to do. And what we must do as industry professionals is make sure that no matter what the answer is, whether it's a yes or a no or something in between, that our trust isn't eroded.
Welcome to the H-Files, the new series of the Hands-On Business podcast, where we dive deep into the world of healthcare leadership and the unique challenges facing small to medium-sized healthcare businesses. I'm Hakeem Adebiyi, and after years of helping businesses grow in various industries, I'm excited to focus on the area that I know the best, healthcare, one of the most dynamic and impactful sectors in the world today. In this series, we're going to explore what it takes to lead and grow in healthcare, from navigating the complexities of regulation and innovation to overcoming the everyday hurdles of building a sustainable business in this fast-paced environment. Each episode will feature real-world insights, expert interviews, and actionable strategies that can help you push your healthcare business forward. So whether you're a leader in the space or an entrepreneur ready to break into it, the H-Files is here to give you the edge. Now, when most of us think about pharmaceuticals, we imagine the end result. We imagine the box on the pharmacy shelf, the pill in the blister pack, the injection in the clinician's hand. But every single one of those started as just an idea, the science in a lab, so to speak. Now, between that first spark and the medicine reaching patients sits a marathon of science, regulation, manufacturing and market access. And inside that journey is a function that rarely gets the spotlight: medical affairs. The team that safeguards scientific integrity, generates and interprets evidence, and enables ethical, non-promotional communication so that therapies are used safely and effectively in the real world. And my guest today, Abdul Hameed Al-Khateeb, who's country medical director in a blue chip pharmaceutical company, has lived that journey up close. With years across medical affairs and the medical affairs disciplines, he understands the science, the strategy, and the reality of turning data into decisions and decisions into access for patients. And today, what we're going to do is break down what it really takes to move a medicine into clinical practice. So we're going to look at the timelines, evidence requirements, real-world data, stakeholder engagement, and more importantly, lessons learned when things get complicated. So welcome to the show, Abdul Hameed.
Thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Now, before we dive into the science and that science to market journey, I'd love for listeners to get to know you a bit better. So could you share a little bit about your career path and what's kept you passionate about working in medical affairs all these years?
Yeah, so I'm a scientist by background. And like most people in the pharma industry who started off in science, I love the science. I didn't love life in a lab so much. And so the pharmaceutical industry for me was a great way actually to keep at the forefront of science and to stay abreast of the latest data and to do something that I was passionate about and curious about, but not have to work in a lab. And I kind of fumbled into the pharma industry really as a trainee associate medical writer in a medical communications agency. I had to Google at that point what medical communications was when I saw the job advert, and I read the description and thought, that sounds like something I'd be interested in. And spent about 10 years in various medcoms roles in the UK, working for a variety of clients, different therapy areas, different products, and kind of aspired one day to be a client and work in big pharma. And so I've been in pharma now for around about 9 years in both global medical affairs roles and also in country medical roles as well as a medical director.
Okay, thanks very much. The next question is an interesting one because now I come from the background of commercial, and often medical affairs is seen as, we jokingly in our businesses call it the sales prevention unit, basically because you are basically the barrier between what a lot of commercial people want to say and what they should say and how they should say it. So what does great medical affairs look like today? And then I want to talk to you about how you measure it, because that's one of the biggest issues that commercial people have with departments like medical affairs. Well, what do you need it for? And aren't they just preventing us from saying and selling in the way we want to sell? So firstly, what does great medical affairs look like today?
So what it isn't sales prevention. We work for commercial entities, and as cross-functional colleagues, we have similar goals. Of course, what it is being right at the forefront of clinical practice and scientific understanding, and being recognized both internally by your colleagues and externally by various stakeholders as a scientifically credible expert. So someone who has a command of the data, the different options, the clinical decision making, the patient journey, and someone who's really able to integrate all of that into a coherent and credible discussion in whatever kind of tactic across the broad spectrum of activities that we have in our industries, and also importantly across the product life cycle. So unlike commercial sales and marketing functions who speak on label or after approval, medical affairs really, we operate across the entirety of the life cycle. So really from early research and development right the way through to a pre-post-launch scenario, and even many years after launch. Medical affairs is one of those functions that's there throughout. And it's really critical to make sure that we're not there just to be compliance police, actually. We're there to really engage credibly with internal and external stakeholders, and hopefully do it in a way which we can be seen as thought partners.
And just on that, before I go into the measurements, because obviously you're going across the whole life cycle of the products, the commercial sales and marketing isn't. How do you integrate to make sure that actually the marketing, because some of the stuff you just talked about there, people would say, well, that's marketing, isn't it? That's communication, that's marketing. So how do you ensure that works hand in hand and there's no sort of buttressing up against each other where people are thinking, well, that's my job, or you're saying, I want you to communicate like this, but the commercial marketers want you to communicate in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, it starts from having a good grasp and a good understanding of what's permitted by whom and in which situation. So some of the activities that we do in our industry are incredibly regulated and very specific. And it's very clear, actually, that only a non-promotional or a medical colleague can lead or engage in that way. In other activities, it's an overtly commercial activity, and we advertise it as such. And so that rightly then sits with the commercial colleagues, but the medical colleagues will always have a role to play, even if it's just kind of putting into the agenda, the slides, making sure things are referenced. It's all about credibility and being able to pass what some might say is a red face test, making sure that in any situation, you're aware of the kind of the company standards and expectations and SOPs, the external standards, whether that's by an industry association or whether it's actually in your local legislation, as well as other external international guidelines that govern best practice around external engagement. So we get trained an awful lot as we develop in our careers around what's permitted and where. And one of the things that we always ask ourselves is, how could this be perceived? And are we doing something that's credible and ethical?
Well, I'm assuming that both me and you will be able to pass the red face test quite easily, actually. But moving on, so how do you actually measure it?
Yeah, I mean, measuring is, I would say it's improving. We're moving away from, basic quantitative metrics around how many calls or how many visits have you had. We're really interested now in quality and quantity, and we're interested in qualitative insights. So when you engage externally, what are those insights that you're bringing back to the team? And how might those insights affect your strategic thinking? And how might those insights affect your strategic thinking, which then can possibly positively influence clinical practice? And so the ways in which you might measure that are thinking about where are your insights and where are your actions noticeably seen in publications, so in the external setting, in real-world data, evidence generation activities, and also in things like HTA submissions to payers. How is the scientific credible story that you're bringing, how is it impacting that process and that decision-making? There are lots of places you can find examples of such metrics and maps. The Medical Affairs Professional Society is probably one good example where people can find out.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I've asked you this question sort of like in a more general term, but then in terms of when you're looking at it on a day-to-day basis, how do you ensure that you keep your exchanges non-promotional? Because guaranteed you're going to be asked questions which are promotional. Will you just hand that over to the commercial team, or how do you make sure that you stick very strictly in that credibility square where you're not moving into the promotional?
So yes, we very clearly have processes and expectations of colleagues. If you're in the field and you're asked a question which per your function isn't appropriate, then you kind of politely acknowledge the question and you say that you'll bring in the relevant colleague. And most people actually are quite happy and satisfied with that. But that's actually one of the things I love about medical affairs, is that you can operate across the entirety of a product life cycle. And so even in a setting which might be considered as commercial or promotional, you can still have a role to play.
That's good. And then in terms of, you talked about before and talking about engagement and insights and how they affect thinking and practice. And you talked about the evidence base in terms of publications, evidence data and submissions. How, or should I say, what evidence gaps do you see most likely or most often block clinician uptake or payer access? And then as a medical affairs professional, how do you then help close those so that then actually when it is handed over to commercial, they've actually got that credibility and the evidence that they require in those two scenarios?
Yeah. It's fair to say that this is an increasing scenario that we find ourselves in. If we imagine that the kind of the gold standard of evidence is a randomized controlled trial, possibly a large phase 3 international study, the reality is that they are costly, they're time consuming, they take a long time to recruit, and they might actually take a long time to provide you with actionable data. And as our ability in diagnostics and in clinical decision improves, we're able to identify more and more subgroups of patients, more and more patients based on clinical or genetic characteristics, perhaps, where actually running a randomized controlled trial would not be appropriate. It would take too long, or you couldn't run a sensible study within a sensible period of time. And so increasingly, real-world evidence generation becomes something that we see more often. And perhaps in the past, review authorities and bodies would see, a randomized controlled trial as the only standard. What we do see increasingly is that in some areas where there is a sensible argument for having smaller real-world data evidence generation efforts, that they can either supplement or in some cases replace those clinical trials. And it's all about then being pragmatic. In some countries like the USA and Germany, the authorities there have certain requirements of companies with certain percentages of the studies being from within the local population. In other areas, you might have a particular ethnicity where there is a higher prevalence of some kind of characteristic. You might actually have other things that you want to look at. So special populations like pediatric setting or women who are breastfeeding. You can't always expect to run those long-term costly studies. And so it's been really pragmatic and really open in what's the right way for us to collect data and also answer a scientific question in a way that's going to be robust and is going to give those clinicians and those payers and other authorities all of the information that they need in order to make their decisions. And there are lots of examples out there and guidelines for doing so. ISFOR is probably one good internationally recognized place. The FDA and the EMA also publish guidelines on that as well.
So from your point of view, when you say real world evidence or pragmatic studies, just give us an example of what sort of thing you're talking about. Is that when you're talking about, as you were just talking about there, about local populations, specific genotypes, potentially specific communities? Is that what you're talking about when you talk about real world evidence?
It can be. It can be areas where there are increasingly kind of niche areas which we're able to identify in an era of personalized healthcare and precision medicine because we've got diagnostic tools that allow us to do so. And so rather than coming up with medicines that might be a one for all, we're actually now looking at medicines that are specifically tailored and targeted towards someone's biology. So someone's kind of underlying genotype or phenotype. And so once you do that, if you're doing that in a patient group where you might say, 1% of the patient population walking through the doors has this marker, it's going to be incredibly hard for you to design a study to collect 1% of the data. And so what you can do is use data from real life clinical practice. And that's where real world evidence generation can be super helpful, not just prospective generation, but actually from years of practice and from identifying signals in broader patient populations that you might not have seen in a robust study. So in a robust study, you might be looking at a few hundred patients. You then go into real life clinical practice and you start to see thousands of patients and you start to see some signals which are interesting. Real world data gives you an opportunity then to go back and analyze that information and pull out those subgroups in a way which is real, it's pragmatic, and it's actually based on clinical practice as well.
And would you suggest, because obviously a lot of people that listen to this work in small to medium-sized companies, they haven't got the large budgets of blue chip companies in the first place. Would you suggest that if you are bringing a product to market and you are on a limited budget, this local real-world pragmatic evidence gathering is probably a better way to go than thinking, well, I have to get, as you said, a randomized, double-blinded study, etc.?
I think there's an element of sense that you need to apply here. It's really understanding the current treatment landscape and understanding the unmet medical needs and understanding where your product potentially might play. That then allows you to design a scientific hypothesis or a question. And then you have to make a call as to actually what's the most sensible way for us to answer this question in order that we get clinically meaningful results. And so what we don't want to see is to answer a question which might give you lovely data. It might be numerically superior to something else, but is that clinically meaningful? Is something that's X percentage higher than an existing standard of care, is that really going to positively change a patient's life? Is it going to impact the clinical decision making by the healthcare professional? And so that's where really the pragmatism comes in, and thinking about what's the appropriate level of robustness that you need. In some cases, you need a randomized controlled trial and you design your clinical development plan as such. But where there are other areas where you can be pragmatic, real world data can be really good to, as I said, quite often support and close off some evidence generation gaps that your trials might not cover, or in some very rare instances, a precursor or a replacement for those data.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, just going back a bit, because when we opened and we were talking about how do you measure its impact, and obviously commercial people are obsessed with measurements and impact, etc. And you talked about insights and evidence gathering. So when you're having your exchanges, when you're doing what you're doing within medical affairs, how do you actually measure the quality and, more importantly, the impact of the insights that you're getting? Because it's all well and good getting insights, what you're doing with them.
Yeah, this is a tricky question. This is a question that has followed medical affairs colleagues for a long time, and it probably still will. And some people are comfortable with this question and some people aren't, because unlike sales colleagues where you can directly kind of correlate sales and performance and calls and so on, how do you do that in a space where you're deliberately not acting in a way that's purely to drive sales? For me, this is all about high quality medical affairs. Is really all about being on the front line, being on the front line with those external stakeholders, whether that's healthcare professionals, patient organizations, government authorities, regulatory authorities, whoever it is, and being seen as a credible, robust, recognized expert, someone who they can trust to have an informed discussion and be a thought partner, and be open that actually when we're engaging with you, we're not just asking for you to talk to us about your product. That's not credible. What's credible is that you're able to articulate across a broad landscape, where does your product play, and actually where does it not play? And where might there be other existing options on the market which are more suitable and more appropriate? There are various tactics and ways in which we engage on the front line, advisory board meetings, standing and chatting to a physician on a booth at a congress, responding to a medical information inquiry, responding to a medical education request, or providing a medical education event. And when you're doing that, what's the feedback that you're getting? So are those healthcare providers and healthcare professionals giving you feedback where they appreciate the clarity, the simplicity, and the openness and the transparency of your responses? Or are they coming back with more questions? Are they coming back saying, well, hang on, that doesn't make sense? And one thing I really love to see is how often do they approach you? So quite often in our industry, we think about going prospectively or reacting sometimes to a request. But how often does a healthcare provider or a professional or an authoritative organization come to you and say, hey, we've got this project, we've got this idea, we've got this initiative, and we want you to partner with us. Of all the companies out there, of all the stakeholders, we want you. And I think for me, when you see that and when you get that, there's nothing more valuable as a vote of approval, if you like, of credibility, and also of their desire to work with someone that they see as a credible partner.
And just on that very last point, actually, because I think that is important, because you're now being positioned as a thought leader that people are going to go to, which is obviously important in terms of the commercial element as well, because they're going to your company, and that then has a knock-on effect in terms of your insights from those payers, and also your influence on those payers in a non-commercial way, of course. So the question there is, how do you get to that position, and how do you discern, in your position specifically, if that position is by virtue of the quality of the outputs that you're giving to the industry, to the payers, etc., or is it just because, well, I work for a massive blue chip organization, so they're always going to come and speak to me, rather than going to speak to a smaller biotech company that may well have someone who's just as knowledgeable, just as communicative, but actually just as known on the same landscape?
Yeah, it's trust. Anyone who's worked in any kind of customer-facing role in any industry will know that building a rapport and establishing trust, and importantly, maintaining trust, is the foundation of any successful relationships. Quite often, in a country situation or even at a global setting, you'll start to interact with the same people repeatedly, particularly if they are therapy area experts in your market or at a global level, or if they're authoritative organizations, or if they're patient groups. Building trust with that credibility, particularly in medical affairs, with that openness and the transparency of your interactions, making sure that you're adhering to all the kind of legal, ethical, and moral obligations that we have to, you're able to then build trust, and maintaining trust through adversity. So sometimes people will come to you with a request, whether it's for funds or for support, and the answer is no. And that's hard. That's a hard answer to give. Nobody likes to say no, but sometimes that's the credible thing to do. And what we must do as industry professionals is make sure that no matter what the answer is, whether it's a yes or a no or something in between, that our trust isn't eroded. The minute you lose that trust, or the minute they see you as less credible, or the minute they see kind of differences in response, well, hang on, you gave me this response, but I heard from Dr. So-and-so that you gave them that response, it erodes your trust, and it's very hard to recover from that. So building a rapport based on trust, based on transparency and good practices is key.
Yeah, and that's really valuable advice, because it doesn't matter the size of the organisation or the name of the organisation. Every single person in medical affairs and more generally just customer-facing roles can do exactly what you've just said. I was just chuckling because you said nobody likes to say no. I was going to say, maybe you want to speak to my son. I think he thinks I love to say no, actually. But yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because you're talking a lot there about your external facing, but one of the things you said earlier on was that medical affairs is about internal and external stakeholders. And obviously one of your roles as a medical affairs is to obviously look at that science in the lab and understand what evidence and the stage gates and the processes are, and what it may be a winner, what may not be a winner. So I was just wondering, because obviously you're collecting that insight and you're getting market insights and you're speaking to clinicians and you're speaking to patients, how do you turn that into action and plans? And do you have any example of where you were almost going against the grain based on your evidence compared to what maybe commercially or other people in the business wanted to do? How do you influence that? So just to clarify, so it's really, how do you turn all the information you have into action, and then how do you change people's plans based on that, so they're actually listening to you, the influence piece?
I think it starts off with having a really good understanding of the landscape. So right from understanding kind of where is clinical practice today and what are the unmet needs? And those unmet needs can be patient-based, it can be unmet needs as a physician might see it, they might be system needs as part of an ecosystem where, in a particular market or setting, there's a real pressure on a hospital ward, and so that becomes a barrier. And so really understanding and listening, asking the right questions and listening with the intention of understanding, not listening with the intention of responding. And once you've got that landscape, that gives you the foundation then to then say, okay, where might we play here? Where can we credibly, based on what we know internally about our product and our vision for how it might impact clinical practice, where can we credibly play? And, an important cross-functional discussion then ensues, and we don't always agree. We sit around the table and we have different opinions, and that's okay. What's really important is that we do that respectfully and that we bring everyone's expertise into the room and we're able to brainstorm and say, where is the right place for us to play? Now, we will not always agree. And so how do we then go about kind of transforming insights into tactical plans and thinking about our strategic decision making? And that's really about, being pragmatic, thinking about the patient population, being empathetic to the patient and their situation, being mindful and trying to put yourself in the shoes of a clinician, be mindful of what the payer is thinking and what kind of data or evidence they're looking for, and then making informed strategic decisions where you might actually say, do you know what? We don't have all the answers here. We're not sure. We don't know whether this is the right decision, but we'll give it a go because it's based on insight. And thinking about how you give it a go in a way that allows you to test, to listen to feedback, to evaluate, maybe to experiment again. So think about maybe shorter cycles, think about rapid cycles of feedback, customer feedback, which is really important. And then making sure that when you get that feedback, you don't just dismiss it. You might only get one bit of feedback and you might think, oh, well, that's a lot of nonsense because our market research or our analysis or our expectation is such and such. But actually, there could be something really interesting in that. And what might we change? And so it's really about generating the right culture internally to make sure that you can have those robust discussions. You can disagree. You can bring all the expertise to the table. You can then agree and make a path forward pragmatically. And in the cycles and in the kind of execution phase, you're also saying, hey, where did we get it wrong? Let's not just assume that every strategic decision that we make and every tactic that we deliver is a roaring success. Actually, we might have got it wrong. Actually, the feedback from a customer might be encouraging us to think about another direction. And so if you have that balance, if you have that openness internally, and you're comfortable with sharing successes and failures, you're then able to make sure that you're continuously evaluating the insights and you're continuously listening to what people externally are saying. Because the worst thing in the world is that you get the same 10 people around the same table, you brainstorm, you walk out with a great plan, and then you break for lunch. That's not the right way to ensure you're successful or that you're credible.
And based on that, so how do you get over that sunken cost fallacy? Because obviously, when you're bringing a pharmaceutical product to market, lots of money, lots of time before it even gets into that blister pack, into the injection, etc. So what you're talking about is that collaborative approach. What happens when the facts change, or not necessarily the facts change, but or the evidence collation? Because obviously you're collating evidence over a long period of time, aren't you? So you may well be thinking, yes, this product is going to be really, really good. And then you get to a point where you've already spent a lot of money, but then the new evidence, as you start speaking to more patients or more clinicians, etc., comes out that actually this probably doesn't, how did you describe it? It doesn't allow you to play effectively in that particular area. Have you got any example of that? What would you be doing in that situation where you start getting more evidence which says maybe this isn't where we should be playing?
Yeah. That's a reality, actually, in our industry, which is one of the other things that I love about working in medical affairs, is that the pace of progress is incredibly rapid and it's frightening. It used to be that we'd look forward to a particular big congress once a year in the summer because that's where you'd see the big clinical practice changing data released. Nowadays, it's really hard to keep up. The pace of medicine and clinical advancing in either diagnostics, screening, or treatment is so fast that you quite often have to be ready to change at a moment's notice. Quite often, you'll have teams that are able to kind of provide you with some competitor intelligence and analyses so that these things shouldn't come always as a surprise, and that you can then kind of roadmap and plan out various scenarios. But when the data break, when the next congress comes, or the next publication is out, or the next treatment has been approved, everything that was true may not suddenly be true. Your vision for clinical practice may suddenly have shifted. The trial that you designed a number of years ago may no longer be evaluating your medicine against the standard of care. The standard of care may have just changed. And so this is something that's really important for us, brings us back to the credibility piece, is to really make sure that we are abreast of the latest information and we're able to have a credible discussion about where our medicines or our products might fit in routine clinical practice today and where they might fit in tomorrow, and be open that actually we might need to change our thinking, we might need to redesign, we might need to actually rip up the plans that we had 12 months ago and take actions and insights based on what we're seeing or what we're hearing from people in the field today.
Thank you. And I think that's really important, because I see so many companies who have invested, and because they've invested, they don't want to change because obviously it costs you more money. And that brings me to, some of my audience, because when you're in a bigger company where you've got bigger budgets, that's not as hard. I mean, it's still hard to do because obviously you spent a lot of money getting to that point. But when you've got a smaller budget, how do you think, what's the best way of mitigating that so that actually before you spend all the money, you've got as much relevant information, so it reduces the chance that you're going to have to change. You're never going to eliminate it completely because, as you said, the market changes. I'm just thinking about companies that don't have the budget to have spent 12 months going in one direction, and then all of a sudden have now got to spend another 12 months redoing a lot of the stuff because it just costs a lot of money. And a lot of the smaller companies don't have that.
Don't assume you know all the answers. Don't assume that you even have asked yourselves the right questions. The number of times you will engage with an external stakeholder and you'll walk away from a meeting thinking, I never would have thought of that, or that's a brilliant, I can't wait to get home or get back to the office and tell the team, or, you kind of send in a quick message to say, I've just heard this great. So it goes back a little bit, I would say, to how you plan your strategy, thinking about where you are with your medicine, where it fits within the current and potential future landscape, thinking about where you expect competitors or other products or other advances in clinical practice to come, and then going out and pressure testing your thinking with the right stakeholders, whether they be therapy area experts or others, but making sure that you're giving yourself every opportunity to course correct. And it may be that something you design in a boardroom or in a lab or in a meeting room, you might think it's perfect, but then you get some feedback from, if it's in a pediatric setting, for example, you get some feedback from parents who say, my child doesn't like to do this, or it's really hard for them to swallow a tablet, or I struggle with giving the injection. And you might think, well, there's lots of information out there. There's lots of literature. There's lots of leaflets that are provided. That doesn't mean that you've thought of everything. So planning your strategy and your tactical implementation prospectively in a way where you're identifying what are the key areas in which we will pause, ask questions, listen, come back and discuss, and potentially course correct.
Yeah, no, and I think it's what's coming through very strongly from what you've been saying from the start is communication is key. And communication, not just to respond, but to understand. And then you just talked about testing. Are you speaking to people, understanding what they're saying, testing it with patients, testing it with clinicians, and understanding the journey of that medicine in terms of the example you gave us, how is it actually administered? Can it be administered in that way? Is it effective, etc.? And you get a lot of more information when you're speaking to real world people. And then what really came out is then listen to that feedback, because one of the things I've seen, I don't want to say often, but I've seen that then destroys the product is that they've got the feedback, Or they sort of like think, well, yeah, it's not that important because there's only this percentage of people saying it, and it can be the death knell of a product.
You never know where that feedback is going to come or where those insights are going to come from. I ran a meeting once, a medical education symposium, and we had a patient speaker on the panel, as well as some prominent international therapy area experts. And we designed, the program to ensure that we had the balance between the clinician perspective and the patient perspective. And the patient was quite nervous, actually, when we were doing rehearsals and practices and so on, about her contribution to a room full of X hundred, I think it was about 400 clinicians. She was absolutely phenomenal. And when she spoke so credibly and with such authority that the room was absolutely silent. And, you asked me before about how do you measure it and how do you measure whether your insights are actionable. The number of people in the evaluation who came back and said, the patient perspective really changed my perspective. And they're practicing clinicians from all around the world. So I think it's been open, not just to seeking feedback and asking for the questions, but actually being open to a broad spectrum of audiences, because you just never know where those insights are actually going to positively impact your strategic thinking and decision making.
No, I appreciate it. And I think patient voice is always critical, I think, in science and technology. In terms of extending that out, so how do you ensure that patient voice is represented in that journey? I mean, that's a good example, but I suppose my question is, people are always reticent because it's a safeguarding issue. It's consent, privacy. How do you manage all that to make sure that the patient doesn't feel exploited, but their message still gets out? Because not always is there going to be somebody who's prepared to sit there and actually give them their story. You may have to anonymize stuff, etc. So I'm just wondering how that all fits in.
I think the first thing here is there is a moral and ethical obligation on all of us to ensure that patient voice is not just sought, it's not just heard, but it's represented appropriately. That's really key. And that's something that, at least in my kind of short career in the industry, I see a really positive trend now towards companies and regulatory authorities and institutions actively and proactively seeking out the patient voice, because they do have a very credible and important part to play throughout the product lifecycle, actually. So we're seeing now more integrated engagement for patients. We're seeing, and compliantly as well, by the way, there are lots of guidelines which we can touch on that give guidance or govern patient interactions. But we are seeing increasingly now patients being involved in clinical study design. We're seeing patients being involved in advisory board meetings. We're seeing patients being asked to attend hearings for reimbursement decisions. And we see patients' voices being heard and sought in parliamentary discussions all around the world. And that's brilliant. That's really good to see that the patient voice is being actively sought and considered. We also see an increase in the prevalence of patient-reported outcomes. So data based on outcomes that are not clinically necessarily measured in a lab or in a clinic. They could be via a survey or a journal. But these PROs, patient-reported outcomes, are increasingly now being captured in various evidence generation activities and then disseminated as well in peer-reviewed publications and congresses. So it's really great to see that voice loud and to see it consistently throughout the product life cycle. It's not just about getting a medicine to market and then asking the patient. We're actively seeing companies and institutions bringing that patient right to the early stage of research and development and involving them and asking them questions with, if we were to propose or to come with something like this and it did that, would that make a noticeable, clinically meaningful impact on your life? Now, the question is, of course, and you touched on it there, how do we do this compliantly? There are a number of things to consider, of course: patient confidentiality, consent, data privacy, protection. And depending on where you are in the world, there are different guidelines that exist. In Europe, everyone's familiar with GDPR around data privacy and protection. The FDA, EMA, even in the UK, there are lots of guidance around patient involvement throughout different stages. And there are also some internationally recognized guidelines like the ICH on informed patient consent and ethical and transparent clinical studies. So each of us who's in the industry needs to be aware of how we can compliantly engage with patients or patient organizations. But that's not a barrier. That's just making sure that we engage appropriately and making sure that we're engaging in a way that's actually meaningful and credible.
No, thanks. I think the earlier you can get the patient involved, the better the products that you're going to bring to the market are going to be, and certainly the more practical. And then, I don't think you can do any podcast on any topic. Well, you can't have any discussion on any topic in 2025 without talking about AI. I'll leave the best to the semi-last. Do you see AI playing a role in your medical affairs team? And if so, how? And what would it be? What does it look like?
Yes, is the short answer. Absolutely. I'd actually be quite worried if people said AI has no role in medical affairs, because let's face it, as consumers, as citizens, AI is seeping in or is already embedded in almost every aspect of our daily lives. I think what I'm really excited to see is we talked a couple of times already about end-to-end in the product life cycles, right from early drug discovery through to launch and then post-launch. And what I'm excited to see is how much AI is playing across that spectrum. So we see it in early drug discovery, target identification, helping us with screening of candidate medicines. We see it in helping us generate scientific hypotheses and run experimental models about potential outcomes of studies. We see it in clinical practice, so increasingly in diagnostics, in screening, in imagery analysis. Almost every day you're seeing publications or articles about how AI can enhance something along that clinical pathway, whether it's in diagnostics or treatment outcomes. So absolutely, yes, it should play a part. I think from an industry kind of medical affairs point of view, where could it play? Probably a few different areas. Who of us wouldn't like help with their admin? So that's the easy one. With your timesheets, with your expenses, with anything that you have to do as a corporate or industry citizen, that's an easy one. I think then really for medical affairs, how does it help you with the science? How does it help you with being that credible thought partner that we've mentioned a few times now? In the past, in order to kind of get a broad understanding of a topic, you'd need to sit at your desk, you'd need to do loads of research, you'd need to do loads of reading. And there is value in that, but why not use AI to help? And I've used it plenty of times to kind of give me a starter on a particular topic. And it's incredible. It's incredible when you prompt well. And that's really important. Getting good at prompting, not just assuming that AI will help you, but really prompting well. It can help with literature reviews. It can help you with identifying evidence generation gaps. It can help you with identifying adverse events of special interest or clinical decision points. It can also help you with communication. So when you get a request, prospectively or reactively, and you need to prepare something or you need to respond, using AI is a really good way of helping shorten that process and making sure that you're able to maximize your time at that forefront, at that cold face with the external environment. The other area I think is in compliance. It's maybe not the most exciting for everyone, but our industry is incredibly restricted and governed, obviously for good reason. And so anywhere where we can see AI helping with either compliance monitoring or oversight or inputting into various tools and systems so that we overall increase our compliance levels, for me, that's a good thing. So I really see this as a question of how and where you use it rather than if, and ensuring that you're able to stay at that forefront of clinical practice. As I've said, the pace of clinical advancing is so rapid now, you almost need AI, I think, in some places to keep ahead of it. And the last thing I'd say is personal growth. Use AI in your learning journey, in your development plan, in seeking and receiving or summarizing feedback, in identifying personal development goals and coming up with ideas for how you might address that, so that you can then take that in an informed, discussion with people around you, your mentor, your coach, your people leader, whoever it is. So absolutely, this is a key part of our industry and our work today.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that probably every industry could, although the list would be different, would be able to say the same in terms of what AI can do for individuals and organizations. And hopefully, over the course of the last 45 minutes or so, that people who didn't know what medical affairs did have got a better understanding of how important medical affairs is in terms of helping and supporting organizations bringing medicines to market and then actually helping them during the launch and post-launch and long into the future. And then the people that knew what medical affairs were, but then described them as the sales prevention unit, can now see how actually if you have a good medical affairs
I'm not a
department,
big fan of that word.
I knew you wouldn't be, but anyway, those sort of people, i.e. people like me, can see how if you have a good medical affairs department, it's going to be significantly additive to you as a commercial operation or being or personnel. So just based on that, I'm going to close on this last question. So if you did have one piece of advice you could give to maybe an individual who before this never even thought about medical affairs, but now start thinking, oh, actually, that sounds quite interesting. What would that advice be in terms of how would you build a career in that space?
Does it have to be just one?
You can give me two, but don't, I know you go on a bit, so, we're at the end now.
I think starting from a historical point of view, there is probably a perception, and it's diminishing, I would say, but it still exists, that in order to have a career or a successful career or any career in medical affairs, you need to be a medical doctor, or you need to be a PhD or a scientific expert in your field. And that's simply not true. There are areas where being a medical doctor or holding a particular deep expertise in an area is super helpful and super relevant. In some cases, it might actually be necessary for you to be a medical doctor. But the absence of those kind of degrees does not preclude you from having a career. So there are lots of ways in which you can get involved in medical affairs. Some of the kind of entry-level roles are MSLs, medical science liaisons, medical manager roles, or even how I started, which is as a medical writer. So not necessarily in-house in a pharma company, but maybe thinking about working for an agency in medical writing, in data analytics, you name it. There's a huge amount of support functions out there. The one piece of advice I would give is that people should take care that they focus their development and their career aspirations not just on skills and competencies, but also on mindsets and behaviors. I think in the past, and even today, people might judge or might hire or might develop or grow based purely on a technical or experience level. But increasingly, with the way our world is evolving and the way that we want to evolve as medical affairs professionals, you need to be able to demonstrate the right mindsets and behaviors. So really having a growth mindset. We talked already about actively listening to understand rather than respond, communication skills, compliance, being pragmatic about where you can play. So that's one advice I would offer. Really think about ensuring that you're not just developing a list of tactics or a list of things in the medical space that you can say, I've done, but you're also ensuring that you're approaching everything with a growth mindset, because some of those behaviors that we've talked about, like building trust and building rapport, they will really come in handy and they can help ensure you have a successful career.
Thank you very much. And I think that's good general advice for any career that you're trying to embark upon, having a growth mindset and not just thinking about the technical aspects of that role. I think a perfect place on which to finish. Abdul Hameed Al-Khateeb, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm hoping now that people, you almost made medical affairs seem interesting and exciting. So hopefully you did manage to do that, and people will really appreciate all the advice you've given.
I'm delighted that that's how you feel about medical affairs now. So thanks for that feedback, and thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
So a great episode with Abdul Hameed there, where we were talking about a very talked about matter, which was the importance of medical affairs and looking at how that have an impact across the whole product life cycle of a healthcare product. And Abdul Hameed talked about the internal and external communication. And the thing that really came across to me was how we were talking about that communication in terms of understanding those internal and external stakeholders and making sure that you always remember the patient voice.
And don't forget to pick up the show notes over at thesalesaccelerationformula.com/podcast-show-notes. You'll also find an option to subscribe to our mailing list so that you can get notes for every single episode straight to your inbox. While you're at it, don't forget to tune in to next week's episode of my new 5 in 5 series, where I share 5 actionable takeaways in just 5 minutes from this episode, which will help you supercharge your business growth. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else who might find it valuable. Most importantly, keep the feedback coming so we can keep improving and bringing you more of what you love. Thank you very much for tuning in. And remember, keep listening, keep growing, and keep thriving.